It's still so vivid in my mind, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. It was a Friday evening, and I was just trying to get home from work. You know how it is in the winter, when it's pitch black by 5 p.m., and the cold feels like it's biting right through your skin. That night was no different, freezing, with the kind of wind that makes you wish you'd stayed home all day. I'd been working late, so by the time I reached the station, the usual crowds had thinned out. The train was practically empty, which honestly felt like a relief at first. I was tired, my brain was fried, and I just wanted to get home, curl up on the couch, and forget about the world for a few hours. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed this guy sitting a couple of rows down from where I was planning to sit. He was big. Really big. Broad shoulders, tall. He had that kind of presence that makes you take a second glance, you know? At first, I didn't think much of it. You see all kinds of people on public transit, especially in the city. So I took a seat near the door, a few seats away from him, and tried to shake off the cold. I settled in, the train hummed to life, and we were off. I was just staring out the window, watching the city lights blur past in the dark, but there was something about that guy. I started to feel uneasy. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him shifting in his seat, like he was trying to get comfortable. But it was more than that. It was like he was restless. His movements weren't fluid. They were too sharp, too deliberate. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, to being tired. You ever get that feeling when you're exhausted that your mind starts playing tricks on you? That's what I told myself was happening. I turned my attention back to the window, trying to focus on the passing scenery, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like there was this energy, this heaviness in the air, coming from him. Then I made the mistake of glancing over. He was staring right at me. I froze. For a second, I didn't even know how to react. His eyes were locked onto mine, and it wasn't the kind of casual glance you might exchange with a stranger on a train. No, his stare was intense, unblinking. Like he was studying me, sizing me up. I could feel my heart rate pick up, and my hands started to get sweaty, even though the train was still as cold as a freezer. I quickly looked away, hoping that would be the end of it, but that unsettling feeling settled deep into my stomach. Something wasn't right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just weird or bored. But I couldn't shake the anxiety that was building inside me. The train rattled along. The sound of the wheels clacking against the tracks echoed in the empty car, but it was like the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. Too fast, too shallow. Then I noticed something else. He had moved closer. Not directly next to me, but he had shifted a couple of seats forward. There was no reason for him to do that. The train was practically empty. Why would he move closer? My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, but none of them felt right. I felt trapped. The idea of moving seats crossed my mind, but then I thought, what if I overreact? What if he's harmless and I just make a fool of myself? But at the same time, every instinct in my body was screaming that I needed to get away from him. My stop was still a few stations away, so I just sat there, rigid, trying to keep my eyes on the window and not look at him again. But that feeling, like a weight pressing down on my chest, was getting worse. The train pulled into the next station, and I prayed someone else would get on, just so I wouldn't be alone with him anymore. No one did. And then, as the doors started to close, I saw him get up. He didn't leave the train. He just stood up, like he was ready to do something. My heart was pounding in my ears now, drowning out everything else. He moved slowly, deliberately, and then, without a word, he sat down right next to me. I almost stopped breathing. He was so close, I could feel the heat radiating off him, smell the smoke clinging to his clothes. It was suffocating. And he didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, but I could feel his presence, like this massive, looming shadow beside me. I didn't dare move. I didn't even want to breathe too loudly, afraid it might set him off. And then, as if it couldn't get worse, he turned his head slightly towards me and muttered something under his breath. I didn't catch it at first, and I wasn't about to ask him to repeat it, but the way he spoke, low and guttural, sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't understand the words, but it sounded threatening. At this point, I I was fighting the urge to just bolt for the door at the next stop, but I didn't want to seem like I was panicking. If he was dangerous, I didn't want to trigger him. I kept telling myself, just a few more minutes. Just stay calm. I was trying to think of an escape plan, my brain running through all the worst-case scenarios. And then, the train pulled into my station. The doors slid open, and I didn't even hesitate. I got up so fast, I nearly tripped over myself, but I didn't care. I just needed to get off that train. I felt his eyes on me as I hurried down the aisle, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stepped onto the platform, and for a moment I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived, because as I started walking towards the exit, I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. My stomach dropped, and the fear that had been simmering in the pit of my stomach flared up into full-blown panic. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, but no matter how fast I walked, I could still hear him behind me. He wasn't close, but he wasn't far enough either. The station was almost deserted, just a few scattered people waiting for the next train, and no one seemed to notice the situation unfolding. Or maybe they did, and just didn't want to get involved. I reached the stairs and took them two at a time, my legs trembling with each step. When I finally made it to the top, I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, standing at the bottom of the stairs, just staring at me. He wasn't moving anymore, just watching me from a distance, like he was daring me to run. I don't know what came over me, but I broke into a full sprint. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from him as possible. My apartment was only a few blocks from the station, but it felt like miles. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to be right behind me, but every time I looked, the street was empty. By the time I reached my building, I was shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out of my bag. I fumbled with the lock, practically throwing myself through the door once it opened. I slammed it shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. Safe. I was safe, or so I thought. I went to the window, just to be sure. And there, across the street, standing under the dim glow of a streetlight, was the man. He didn't follow me all the way. He was just there, standing, smoking, watching. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he flicked his cigarette to the ground, turned, and walked away. Like it was all just some game to him. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, every creak of the building made me jump. I kept expecting to see his face pressed against the window or to hear a knock at the door, but he never came back. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget that look in his eyes, the way he stared at me like I was nothing more than prey. You know, she continued, her voice lower now, like she was confessing something she had never fully processed. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. I convinced myself it was just some random creep trying to mess with me, maybe to scare me or something. But she hesitated, her eyes shifting uneasily as if recalling the next part of the story made her skin crawl. But then things got strange. It wasn't long after that night, maybe a week later, that I started noticing signs, little things at first. Stuff that's easy to dismiss, you know? For instance, I'd come home and find my door unlocked, and I swear to you, I locked it. I always lock it. I'm paranoid about it. I double-check it before I go to bed, before I leave the house, everything. But twice that week, I came home from work and found the door just slightly ajar. The first time, I thought maybe I was in a rush that morning and forgot to pull it shut all the way. The second time, I blamed the wind. It's an old building, maybe it got caught on a draft. But then things started getting personal. One morning I woke up and my phone was gone. Not misplaced, not under the couch cushions or anything like that, just gone. And listen, I'm not the type to lose stuff, okay? My phone is always by my bed on the nightstand, charging. But when I woke up that day, it wasn't there. I tore the whole apartment apart, searched every inch of my place, but it was nowhere to be found. Eventually, I gave up and chalked it up to bad luck. Maybe I dropped it on the way home from work the day before or something. But then that same afternoon, while I was sitting at work, I got this feeling in the pit of my stomach. You know that gut instinct? That awful prickling sense that something's wrong? I couldn't shake it. So I did something I'd never done before. I pulled up the security footage from my apartment building. You see, my building has this old grainy CCTV camera in the lobby, mostly for show. But I figured, what the hell, I might as well check. And that's when I saw him. She stopped for a second, visibly shaken now, her eyes dark and troubled as the memory gripped her. The guy from the train, the man, he was there, on the footage, standing outside the building, right in front of the door, in the middle of the night, just standing there, for hours. I couldn't believe it at first, but there he was, staring right at the door like he was waiting for me to come out. He didn't do anything, he didn't try to get inside, didn't try to break in, he just waited. And then right before sunrise, he left. I didn't know what to do. I felt sick. My stomach turned into knots. It felt like all those irrational fears I had on the train weren't so irrational anymore. They were real. This guy wasn't just some random creep who stared too long. He was following me. I called the police. Of course I did. But you know how they are with stuff like this. They took a report, asked me a bunch of questions, but since he hadn't actually done anything, there wasn't much they could do. It could be a coincidence, they said. Maybe he lives nearby, they suggested. They didn't get it. This wasn't some random guy wandering by. He was watching me, waiting for me. And worse, he knew where I lived. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual. I really did. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that maybe the police were right, and this was just some weird, isolated thing. But every time I walked home, every time I came up to my building, I had this feeling that someone was watching me. And then one night, it got worse. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard it. This soft tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a tree branch hitting the window or something. But it wasn't. It was coming from inside the apartment, from my front door. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was, this quiet, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention without waking up the whole building. I froze. I didn't even breathe for a minute. And then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. I got out of bed, moving as quietly as I could, and grabbed my phone. I was going to call the police again, but when I looked at the screen, I realized something that made my blood run cold. My phone, it was already on, and the camera was running. It had been recording for hours. The video was just my ceiling, the same view as if it had been propped up on the nightstand. But here's the thing, I didn't turn it on. I didn't even remember finding my phone after it went missing. I don't know how, but somehow, he had been in my apartment. There was no other explanation. He had been here while I was asleep, and I hadn't even known it. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, but by then, I was already in a full-blown panic. I didn't care anymore. I called the police and told them everything, begging them to send someone over right away. They arrived pretty quickly, but by the time they got there, whoever had been at my door was gone. Of course. They did a sweep of the building, checked the footage again, but just like before, they couldn't find anything. No one had been caught on camera. No one had seen anything. It was like he just vanished. That was the last straw for me. I packed up what I could and went to stay with a friend for a while. I didn't care if it seemed paranoid. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. Not after everything that happened. And here's the kicker. She paused, her voice trembling with disbelief. When I finally moved out of that place a month later, I asked the landlord if anyone had ever reported anything strange before. You know what he told me? That apartment had been empty for months before I moved in because the last tenant, she'd been harassed by a man who followed her home from the train too. He said she'd filed multiple police reports, saying someone was stalking her, tapping on her door at night, even stealing things from her apartment. She moved out suddenly and no one heard from her again. The landlord thought she was just being paranoid, but now, I'm not so sure. She ended her story with a long, deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as they rested on her lap. So I guess, she said, looking up finally, if you ever feel like someone's watching you, trust your gut. You ever get that feeling, he began, leaning forward slightly, his voice taking on a quieter, more serious tone. Like something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. Like you just know, deep in your gut, that something's off, even though everything looks normal. That happened to me a few months ago. He paused, his eyes scanning the room, almost as if he was trying to see if anyone else could understand what he had felt that day. It was supposed to be a regular hike, nothing too special. I've always liked hiking, getting away from the city, clearing my head. There's something about being out in the open air, surrounded by nature, that makes you feel alive. It's like all the noise in your brain just fades away. That day, I had picked a trail I hadn't done before. It was a little out of the way in this state park about an hour and a half from my place. I'd read about it online, a moderate trail, about 5 miles, with a mix of forest and some cool overlooks. The weather was perfect too, late fall, crisp air, leaves turning all shades of red, orange, and gold. The kind of day where it feels good just to breathe. The first few miles were exactly what I expected. Quiet, peaceful. The trail was well marked, not too busy. I think I passed maybe 2 or 3 people the whole time, but for the most part, it felt like I had the whole place to myself. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional bird, even the distant sound of a stream running parallel to the trail. I was about halfway through the hike when I came to this old wooden bridge. He stopped, frowning a bit, as if the memory unsettled him just by bringing it up again. Now, I've crossed a lot of bridges on hikes before, some rickety, some solid, but this one gave me a weird feeling right from the start. It wasn't that the bridge looked dangerous or anything. It was just old. Weathered planks, darkened by years of exposure, moss growing in between some of the boards. The kind of thing you'd expect in a forest like that. But there was something else about it that just didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way it stood out, a straight, unnatural line cutting across this deep ravine, with the forest pressing in on either side. Or maybe it was just too quiet. The air felt heavier there, like the world had gotten still, like everything around me was holding its breath. I stopped for a second at the edge of the bridge, looking across. It wasn't that long, maybe 20 or 30 feet, but the drop below was steep, and I could hear the sound of water rushing far below. The mist rising up from the river gave the place an eerie feel. I hesitated, but I wasn't about to turn back over a stupid bridge. So, I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first plank. The wood creaked under my weight, but it held. I started walking, my footsteps slow and deliberate, the boards groaning softly with each step. Halfway across, I heard a rustling behind me. Just the wind, I told myself, but that's when things got strange. Out of nowhere, the whole bridge started shaking. Not just a gentle sway. No, this was a hard, jarring shake that made me lose my balance for a second. I had to grab the rope railing to keep from falling. The whole thing felt like it was going to give way. And then I saw him. There was a man standing at the other end of the bridge, just standing there, watching me. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together, the memory clearly sending a shiver through him. I hadn't seen him before. He hadn't been there when I started across, of that I'm sure. It was like he had just appeared. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, motionless on the other side of the bridge. He was tall, maybe in his 40s or 50s, with this strange, heavy coat on, way too thick for the weather. His face was hard to make out at first, but the way he was standing, his posture, it was unsettling. Like he was blocking my path and I couldn't go anywhere. I stopped, right in the middle of the bridge, gripping the rope tightly, trying to steady myself. My heart was pounding, partly from the bridge's sudden movement, but mostly because of this guy. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there staring at me. And it wasn't like a normal, casual stare. It felt predatory, like he was waiting for something. I can't explain it, but I felt this wave of danger coming off him, like my body was screaming at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't. I was stuck. The bridge was too narrow to turn back without risking a fall, and I wasn't about to bolt past him either. So I just stood there, locked in this awful, silent standoff. The bridge was still swaying, and I was trying to stay upright, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I glanced down at the water below. It was swirling, faster than it should have been, like something was pulling it into a vortex. It didn't make any sense, but that's what it looked like. And that's when he moved. It was subtle at first, just a shift in his stance. But then he took a step forward, and I swear everything in me went cold. His face, it was shadowed, but when he stepped closer, I saw his eyes. They were wrong. Dark, empty, like there was nothing behind them. No emotion, no life, just blackness. I don't know how to explain it, but looking into those eyes felt like looking into a void. Like if I stared too long, I'd lose myself in them. He took another step, and that's when I snapped out of it. I forced myself to move, to get off that damn bridge as fast as I could. I didn't care if it was shaking or if the planks were creaking. I just needed to get to the other side, away from him. But every step I took, he took one too, matching my pace. Like he was daring me to run, daring me to make the first move. Finally, I was just a few feet away from him, close enough to see the strange, twisted expression on his face. And then, just as I was about to reach the end of the bridge, he stepped aside, almost like he was letting me pass. But as I tried to walk past him, he reached out and grabbed my arm. His grip was ice cold. Not just cold like a normal person's hand, but freezing, like it burned. I jerked back, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened, and I could feel the cold spreading, creeping up my arm. I looked at him, panic surging through me, and his face, God, his face, it changed. For a split second, it was like his skin rippled, his features distorted, becoming something else entirely, something inhuman. I don't know where I found the strength, but I wrenched my arm free and bolted. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could down the trail, not caring about anything except getting as far away from that bridge as possible. My heart was pounding in my ears, my lungs were burning, but I didn't stop until I was back at my car. When I finally did stop, I looked down at my arm, and there was this dark mark like a bruise where he'd grabbed me. But it wasn't just a bruise, it was like frostbite. My skin was white, almost blue, and it hurt like it had been burned by ice. I didn't know what to do. I sat there in my car, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Who was that guy? And more importantly, what was he? I never told anyone about it, not really. I mean, what would I even say? That some thing on a bridge tried to pull me into a frozen death grip. No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself, and it happened to me. But that bruise, that mark, it didn't go away for weeks. And every now and then I'll get this weird feeling, like someone's watching me. I'll be walking down the street or driving somewhere, and out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of someone, a tall man, wearing a thick coat, standing still, just watching. But when I look directly at him, he's gone. I haven't been hiking since. He sat there for a moment, eyes distant, as if he could still feel the lingering chill from that day. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that makes you check the corners of the room, makes you want to lock the door without really knowing why. It's funny, he continued after a long pause, his voice softer now as though he was still processing it himself. For the longest time, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was just tired, you know? Maybe I was overreacting, and it was just some guy messing with me. But then, other things started happening. Little things at first, but enough to make me doubt my own reality. He leaned back, running a hand over his face as if shaking off the thought. Like, for instance, the frostbite. It didn't go away, not for weeks. And even after the bruising faded, I could still feel it, like the cold had seeped into my bones. Every time I looked at my arm, it felt like a reminder that he was still out there, still watching me. But what really got to me was the dreams. His voice dropped lower, and his gaze locked onto the table in front of him, as if he were staring at something only he could see. At first, they were just flashes, like I'd wake up in a cold sweat with this image burned into my mind of him. Standing at the edge of the bridge, his eyes empty and dark, looking right at me, like he was waiting for something. Every time I'd wake up, the same feeling hit me, dread, like something was coming, and there wasn't anything I could do to stop it. He shook his head, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the surface of the table. Then the dreams got worse. They stopped being just dreams. They felt real, too real. I'd be back on that bridge, but this time I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, and I'd hear this sound, this creaking like wood groaning under pressure. The bridge would start shaking again, only worse than before, like it was on the verge of collapsing. And then, I'd see him, standing at the other end, just like before. Only this time, he'd be closer. Each time I dreamed it, he was closer. His breath hitched, as if the memories were hard to retell. The last dream, he wasn't at the other end anymore. He was right in front of me. His hand, his freezing hand, was on my arm again. And his face, it was like it was decaying, like the skin was peeling off, revealing something worse underneath. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't even move. He exhaled deeply, as if trying to shake the sensation from his body. That's when I knew. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. I could feel him. His presence. It wasn't just in my dreams anymore. I'd wake up and the room would be freezing, like someone had opened all the windows in the dead of winter. But they'd all be closed, locked, and my arm, the same one he'd grabbed, would be numb with cold, like he was still holding me, even when I was awake. He glanced up for the first time in a while, his eyes searching the faces of those around him, as if looking for some confirmation that what he was saying wasn't insane. I thought it would stop if I just ignored it, but it didn't. That feeling, that sense of being watched, it got worse. I couldn't escape it. Every time I left my apartment, every time I went for a walk, I'd catch glimpses of him, in my peripheral vision, always in the distance, standing still, watching. I'd turn to look and he'd be gone. But I knew he was there. I could feel him, like he was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment. I thought it would stop if I just ignored it, but it didn't. That feeling, that sense of being watched, it got worse. I couldn't escape it. Every time I left my apartment, every time I went for a walk, I'd catch glimpses of him, in my peripheral vision, always in the distance, standing still, watching. I'd turn to look, and he'd be gone. But I knew he was there. I could feel him, like he was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment. He ran his fingers through his hair, his voice now shaking slightly. A couple of weeks ago, it got worse. I was walking to my car after work, and I got this feeling like something was about to happen. That gut instinct, you know? And sure enough, I saw him. This time, he wasn't far away. He was standing in the parking lot, about 20 feet from me, just staring. And this time, he wasn't just watching, he smiled. The word hung in the air, and everyone listening could feel the weight of it. It wasn't a normal smile. He said, his voice barely above a whisper now. It was twisted, like he knew something I didn't, like he was enjoying this. I froze. I couldn't move. And then, he started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like my whole body had shut down, like I was trapped in one of those nightmares again. But this wasn't a dream. I was wide awake, and he was coming straight for me. He paused, swallowing hard. And then, just when he was almost close enough to touch me, something snapped. I don't know how, but I broke free. I ran to my car, slammed the door shut, and drove out of there like my life depended on it. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, he was gone. Just gone. Like he'd never been there at all. He looked around the room, his voice growing quieter, almost like he was ashamed of what he was about to say. I'm afraid he's not going to stop. I don't think this is over. I don't know who he is or what he is, but I know he's not done with me yet, and I don't know what's going to happen when he finally catches up. The room fell silent. There was nothing anyone could say to ease the tension, to reassure him that everything would be fine. Because deep down, everyone could feel it, the cold, creeping sensation that he wasn't alone in this. He stood up, his hands trembling slightly, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned one last time, his eyes dark and filled with a quiet desperation. If you ever come across a bridge like that, he said, his voice almost a plea, don't cross it. Don't even go near it. Some places are wrong, and once they've marked you, there's no going back. And with that, he was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to seep into the very air of the room, the weight of his story pressing down on everyone like a shadow. It was the summer after I graduated from college, when I moved into this old, creaky house. It wasn't a mansion or anything grand, just an old two-story home that had been standing for what seemed like decades, if not longer. The rent was cheap, and honestly, I didn't mind the idea of being alone for a while. I needed some time to clear my head and figure out the next steps in life. You know how it is after you graduate. But looking back now, I realized just how wrong I was about needing solitude. From the very first night, something felt off. The house had this old smell like damp wood mixed with the musty scent of aged wallpaper that clung to the walls. The floors creaked with every step, and at night the silence was almost suffocating. You know, that kind of silence that makes you question whether you're actually alone. At first, I thought it was just my nerves, adjusting to a new place and all. But then the knocking started. The first time I heard it, it was subtle, a light tapping, barely noticeable, like the wind pushing against a loose shutter. It was raining that night, one of those heavy, steady summer rains. I was in my room upstairs, the window cracked open just a little, letting in that cool breeze that smells like wet grass. I was reading, or at least trying to, but I kept hearing it. This soft knock, knock, knock coming from the front door downstairs. I told myself it was probably just the wind, maybe a branch from one of the old oak trees out front. It didn't bother me too much, so I ignored it. But then, it happened again the next night. Same time, same slow, deliberate knock, knock. By the third night, I was starting to get annoyed. I mean, who knocks on someone's door that late, especially in the rain? But when I'd open the door, no one was ever there. No footsteps in the mud, no sign that anyone had even approached the porch. Just the empty street, the sound of rain falling on the pavement, and the dim glow of the streetlight at the corner. As the days passed, the knocking became more frequent, every night without fail, and each time it seemed to grow a little louder, a little more insistent. I started locking all the doors and windows, double-checking before bed, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. If anything, it got worse. One night, the knocking woke me from a dead sleep. It was louder this time, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was desperate to get in. I checked the time, 3:15 a.m. The rain was coming down harder than usual, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old window frames. The knocking came again, this time with more force. Bang! 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 It sounded like someone was about to break the door down. My heart was racing. I got up, grabbed my phone, and slowly made my way downstairs, each creak of the floorboards echoing through the house. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, half expecting the door to burst open on its own. When I finally opened it, nothing. No one. Just the rain and the empty street. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cold air wash over me, and then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow. At first, I thought it was my own reflection in the window, but it wasn't. It moved quickly, darting across the yard and disappearing into the darkness. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and locked it tight. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what or who could be doing this. The next morning, I told myself I was imagining things. Lack of sleep, stress, isolation. It could all mess with your head, right? But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. For a few days, the knocking stopped, and I almost convinced myself that it was over. But then one night, the rain returned, and so did the knocking. Only this time, it wasn't just from the front door. It was all around me. The windows, the walls. It sounded like the entire house was being surrounded. Bang! 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 The knocking was everywhere, louder than ever, as if something was trying to break in from every angle. Panicking, I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, my back pressed against the door, heart racing. The knocks continued, relentless, echoing through the house. I could feel the walls shaking, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then I heard it, a soft creak behind me, like the sound of someone stepping on the old wooden floorboards. I turned around, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was hard to make out at first, just a dark silhouette in the dim light. But as the lightning flashed outside, I saw it. A face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes staring right at me. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. The figure took a step closer, and I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the bed. For a moment, I thought it was going to reach out, grab me, but then it vanished. Gone, just like that. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I kept seeing that face, those empty eyes, every time I closed my eyes. I started keeping the lights on, afraid of the dark, afraid of what might be lurking just beyond my sight. A week later, I packed up and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't care about the rent or the fact that I had no other place to go. I just needed to get out. After I moved, I did some digging, trying to find out if there was any history to the house. And, of course, there was. Turns out, years ago, a woman who lived there disappeared one night during a storm. They never found her, but some say she was taken, lured out by something or someone that knocked on her door in the middle of the night. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back to that house again. And if you ever hear knocking in the middle of the night, don't open the door. After leaving that house, I thought it was all over. I moved into a small apartment in the city, surrounded by people and noise. No more knocking in the middle of the night. No more feeling like someone was watching me. Life seemed to get back to normal. I threw myself into work, socialized, and tried to forget the bizarre and terrifying events that had happened. But of course, it didn't stay that way for long. It was about 2 weeks after the move when the nightmares started. At first, they were subtle, just shadows in the dark, whispers at the edge of my consciousness. I would wake up in a cold sweat, unsure whether what I dreamed was real or not. But then they became more vivid, more real. In one of the dreams, I was back in that old house, standing in the living room. Everything looked the same, the old wooden floors, the peeling wallpaper. It was raining outside, the same heavy, relentless downpour that had followed me for what felt like months now. And then I heard it again, the knocking. Slow, deliberate, growing louder with every beat of my heart. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was like I was glued to the floor, forced to wait for whatever was coming. The knocking grew more insistent, louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I could feel the presence, cold, oppressive, looming over me. But when I turned around, nothing was there. I woke up gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a dream. But the fear didn't leave me, and soon it wasn't just happening in my sleep. One night, I was sitting in my living room, trying to relax after another long day at work. It had started raining again, another storm rolling through the city, and I was curled up on the couch, mindlessly flipping through TV channels. That's when I heard it. Knock, knock. I froze. It wasn't possible. I wasn't in that house anymore. This was my new apartment, miles away from that place, but the knocking continued, slow and steady, coming from the front door. I didn't want to believe it. I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the door. The knocking persisted, growing louder with each passing second. Bang! 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 It was the same forceful knocking I'd heard that last night in the old house. The same sense of dread settled over me, chilling me to the bone. I got up slowly, my feet moving before my mind could catch up. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached for the knob, trembling. I flung the door open, and nothing. Just the empty hallway of my apartment building lit by the dull fluorescent lights. No one was there. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the emptiness, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The hallway remained silent, still, as if mocking my fear. I shut the door, locking it tight, and tried to shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't over. Whatever it was, it had followed me. Over the next few days, the knocking became a constant companion. It didn't matter if it was raining or not anymore. It would start up at random times, day or night. At first, it was just at the door, but soon, I started hearing it everywhere. On the windows, on the walls, even from the ceiling above my bed. One night, the knocking woke me up again. But this time, it wasn't just coming from one spot. It was all around me. The walls of the apartment seemed to shake with the force of it. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing, ears straining to catch any other sound. And then I heard something that chilled me to my core. It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the relentless banging. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it was there, circling me, growing louder with each knock. It sounded like a voice from the depths of the grave, cold and hollow. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, dialed a friend's number, and blurted out everything. It all came pouring out. The house, the knocking, the shadow, the way it followed me. I expected them to laugh, to tell me I was crazy, but instead, there was silence on the other end. Then, after a long pause, my friend spoke, their voice low and serious. "You need to leave. Get out of there. Right now." I didn't need to be told twice. I threw on my coat, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the apartment, not even bothering to pack a bag. I drove aimlessly for hours, not sure where I was going, just trying to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. Eventually, I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, and that's where I've been ever since. I can't go back. I won't. The knocking hasn't stopped, though. Even here, miles away from that cursed house, I still hear it. Every time it rains, it's there, just on the edge of my hearing. Sometimes it's faint, barely noticeable. Other times, it's as loud as ever, banging on the walls, the door, the windows, as if it's trying to find a way in. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me. All I know is that it's never going to leave me alone. So if you ever hear knocking in the middle of the night, especially when it's raining, don't open the door. Don't listen. Whatever it is, don't let it in, because once it finds you, it will never let go. You know that feeling when you sense someone's watching you? When the air around you changes, grows colder, and your skin prickles, but there's no one there, no one you can see at least. That's been my reality for the past few weeks. It's gotten to the point where I dread coming home. I mean, this is my place where I'm supposed to feel safe, but something's off. And I'm not the only one who feels it. My roommate Josh, he's been acting weird too. It started subtly at first, like small things we could brush off as us being tired or imagining things. But now, I don't know. Let me backtrack a little. Josh and I have been sharing this apartment for about a year now. It's a decent place, old but affordable. Nothing fancy. The kind of place where the floorboards creak and the pipes rattle, especially when the weather gets cold. I never thought much of it. You know how these old buildings are. They're full of quirks. But then the footsteps started. It was late, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, unable to sleep. Everything was quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the window panes. That's when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't heavy, more like a soft shuffling, like someone walking barefoot across the hardwood floors in the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I thought it was Josh. He sometimes gets up in the middle of the night, either to grab a drink or use the bathroom, so I didn't think much of it. But as the footsteps got closer to my room, I realized something was off. Josh's room is at the other end of the apartment, and these steps, they were coming from the living room, right outside my door. They were too slow, too methodical, like whoever, or whatever, was walking didn't want to be heard. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, trying to catch every sound. The footsteps stopped just outside my room. For a moment, everything was still. My heart was racing, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I was just hearing things. I stood up, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. The light from the street lamps outside barely filtered through the window, casting long, faint shadows across the walls. But there was no one there, just an empty hallway. The living room was still and dark, everything exactly where it should be. I checked Josh's door, which was slightly ajar. He was sound asleep, snoring softly. I sighed, feeling a bit foolish, and went back to bed. The next morning, I asked Josh if he had been up during the night. He gave me a blank look and shook his head. "Nah, man. I was dead asleep." "Why?" I told him about the footsteps, but he just shrugged it off. "It's probably just the building settling or something. You know how these old places are." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But over the next few nights, the footsteps kept coming. Every night around the same time. Always the same, slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer to my room, and then stopping, as if someone was just standing there waiting. I never saw anything, though. Never caught anyone in the act. But the feeling of being watched, that was real. I felt it deep in my bones. Things got worse about a week later. Josh and I were sitting in the living room one evening, watching a movie. It was one of those quiet nights where nothing much was happening. The weather was mild, no wind, no rain, just calm. We were halfway through the movie when it happened. At first, it was subtle. The coffee table in front of us creaked slightly, like something had shifted its weight on it. Josh and I both glanced at each other, but neither of us said anything. We were probably just being paranoid, right? But then, right in front of us, one of the pillows on the couch lifted. Not like it fell off or slipped to the side. It lifted, a good few inches into the air, and then flew across the room. It hit an empty beer can on the coffee table with a soft thud, knocking it to the floor. Josh shot up from the couch. "Did you see that?" "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My skin had gone cold, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. I knew we couldn't explain this away as just creaky floors or a drafty window. We sat there in silence for a moment, just staring at the pillow lying on the floor. Neither of us moved. I kept expecting something else to happen, like more objects to start flying around the room or for the lights to flicker, but nothing did. The apartment was eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath. "I'm out of here," Josh said, grabbing his jacket. "I can't deal with this right now." "Where are you going?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why. I didn't want to stay here either. "I don't know. Just anywhere but here." He shot me a look that was part fear, part disbelief, like he couldn't believe what we had just seen. I followed him out the door, and we ended up at a diner a few blocks away. We didn't talk much at first, just sat there, both of us trying to process what had happened. After a while, Josh broke the silence. "Do you think this place is like haunted?" I didn't know what to say. I mean, it sounded ridiculous, right? But what other explanation was there? We had both seen that pillow move. There was no way to explain it. "Maybe," I said slowly. "I don't know, but something's definitely not right." For the next few days, we both tried to avoid being home as much as possible. Josh stayed at his girlfriend's place most nights, and I found excuses to work late or hang out with friends. But eventually we had to go back. The footsteps returned, of course, and the feeling of being watched. It never went away. Sometimes I'd be sitting in the living room just watching TV, and I'd feel it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was standing right behind me. I'd turn around, but there was never anyone there. The worst part, though, was the dreams. I started having these vivid nightmares where I was trapped in the apartment and I couldn't escape. In the dreams, the apartment was always dark and the footsteps were louder, faster, chasing me. I'd run from room to room, but every door I opened just led me back to the same hallway, back to the living room. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. Tall, shadowy, featureless. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching me. Every time I woke up from those dreams, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. And every time I could swear I heard the footsteps in the hallway, faint but unmistakable. I don't know what it is that's haunting our place. Maybe it's just the building. Maybe something happened here years ago that we don't know about. But whatever it is, it's not going away. Josh and I are moving out next month. We're done. I don't care if we have to break the lease or pay a penalty. I just want to be out of there. I can't take it anymore. The footsteps, the feeling that someone or something is always watching us. But here's the thing. Even though we're leaving, I can't shake this feeling. I can't stop thinking about that shadow in my dreams, standing there, silently watching. And I wonder, what if it's not just the apartment? What if it follows us? Because deep down, I know. I don't think it's finished with me yet. You never really think about the places you move into, not in any meaningful way. I mean, sure, you might care about the square footage or whether it's in a good neighborhood, but you never really wonder about the house itself. Not about who lived there before you, what they left behind, not just their furniture or their trash, but the other things. The things you can't see. At least, I never did. Not until it was too late. It started when I moved into this old Victorian house. You know, the kind that looks like it's been standing for 100 years and will probably stand for 100 more. It had charm, character. It wasn't perfect, but I wasn't looking for perfect. I was looking for a place where I could be alone for a while, to get my life back on track. A fresh start, if you will. And for a while, it was exactly that. The first few days were fine. Great, even. I spent most of my time unpacking, getting settled, exploring the house. It had these tall, narrow windows that let in just enough light to make everything look softer, older, like the whole place was preserved in time. The floors creaked when you walked on them, but it wasn't unsettling. It was just part of the house's personality. There was a certain stillness to it, a kind of quiet that was comforting after the chaos of city life. I thought I'd found peace, but then the dream started. The first one wasn't terrifying, just strange. I dreamed that I was walking through the house late at night. Everything was dark except for the soft glow of the moon through those tall windows. The wind outside was howling, rattling the glass, but inside it was still, silent. In the dream, I wandered from room to room, not really sure what I was looking for. I felt this overwhelming need to keep moving, to find something, or maybe someone, but I never did. That's when I saw her, the woman. She was standing in the hallway, facing the far wall, her back to me. She was tall and thin, with long black hair that hung down past her shoulders. I couldn't see her face, but there was something about her posture, something tense, like she was waiting for something, or bracing herself. I wanted to say something, to ask her who she was and what she was doing in my house, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't move. And then she ran. She ran so fast, faster than anyone should be able to. Her feet didn't make a sound, but I could feel the air shift as she raced down the hallway toward the wall at the end. It happened so quickly that my brain barely registered it. She didn't slow down, didn't stop, and when she reached the wall, she disappeared. Not like she vanished into thin air. It was more like she hit the wall but melted into it, as though the wall swallowed her whole. I woke up with a jolt, my heart pounding in my chest. My room was cold, colder than it should have been for late summer. I lay there for a while, trying to shake off the lingering unease, convincing myself it was just a dream. Just a weird, vivid dream. But it kept happening. Every night. The dreams were always the same. I'd wander through the house feeling lost and unsettled, and then I'd see her, the woman with the black hair, always standing with her back to me, always running toward the wall, disappearing just before she hit it. And every time I woke up more rattled than the last. It started affecting my days. I was tired all the time, distracted, jumpy. I told myself it was stress, or maybe just the adjustment to a new place. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The thing is, it wasn't just the dreams. That was bad enough, but soon, other things started happening. It began with small things, things I could explain away at first. A door that I knew I'd closed would be slightly ajar. A light that I was sure I'd turned off would be on again. Stuff like that. It was annoying, but not scary. Not at first. But then it escalated. One night, I was sitting in the living room watching TV. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was trying to wind down after another long day of unpacking and dealing with the usual moving headaches. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. That's when I heard it, a soft thump, like something had fallen over upstairs. I muted the TV and listened. Silence. I thought maybe it was nothing, but then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate sound, like someone was walking down the hall on the second floor. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I lived alone. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to guide me as I slowly made my way upstairs. The hallway was empty, dark. I could still hear the sound of footsteps, though, faint but unmistakable, coming from the far end of the hall near my bedroom. The air felt colder up here, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. My breath came out in short, shallow puffs, but I kept moving, convinced I'd find some logical explanation. But there was nothing, no one. I checked every room, every closet, but the house was empty, just me and the stillness. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was so intense that it made my skin crawl. And then it got worse, much worse. I started noticing it during the day, too. I'd be in the kitchen making coffee, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see movement. Just a flash, like someone darting past the doorway. But when I'd turn to look, no one was there. Or I'd be sitting at my desk, trying to focus on work, and I'd hear the faintest whisper, too quiet to make out any words, but enough to send a chill down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck would stand up, and I'd get that prickling sensation, like I was being watched. Then came the cold spots. I'd walk through the house, and suddenly the temperature would drop, just in one specific area, like stepping into a freezer. The cold would seep into my bones, making me shiver uncontrollably. And always, always, in those moments, I'd feel it. Her, watching me, waiting. The final straw came one night, about a month after I moved in. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but the house felt wrong. The silence was oppressive, like the walls were holding their breath. I couldn't relax, couldn't drift off, no matter how hard I tried. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just my imagination, but the sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting, heart pounding in my chest. And then the door opened. It didn't creak or groan, it just swung open, smoothly, silently. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I didn't dare move, didn't dare open my eyes. But I could feel her. She was there, standing in the doorway, watching me. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I don't know. Time seemed to stretch, to warp around me. I could hear my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears, but nothing else. No more footsteps, no more sounds, just the cold and the overwhelming sense of dread. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my eyes, and there she was, the woman from my dreams, standing at the foot of my bed, her face obscured by her long black hair. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel her eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. And then she ran. Just like in the dream, she sprinted toward the wall, her feet barely making a sound on the floor. But this time, she didn't disappear. This time, she hit the wall and stopped. She stood there, pressed up against the wall, her hands flat against it, as though she was trying to push her way through. Her body trembled, and for the first time I saw her face, pale, twisted in a mask of terror. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as though she was trapped in some endless nightmare. And then she turned to look at me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, her expression a mixture of fear and desperation. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, helpless, as she slowly faded into the wall, vanishing before my eyes. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I never went back to that house, never tried to figure out who she was or why she was there. All I know is that she was real. As real as the cold air that filled the house, as real as the footsteps that haunted me every night. And sometimes when I'm alone, late at night, I still hear her. I guess I've always been a little jumpy, the kind of person who gets spooked by a creak in the floorboards or the way the wind howls at night. It's probably why I ended up in the middle of nowhere, in this tiny old house surrounded by woods. Peace and quiet, away from people, away from noise. It sounded like a dream at first, a chance to reset, breathe a little easier, escape the grind of everyday life. But that feeling didn't last long. It started almost immediately, this creeping sense of unease that I couldn't explain. At first, it was small things, like I'd hear a faint rustling sound when I was outside, or a soft knock coming from inside the walls. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe animals in the woods, raccoons, squirrels, that kind of thing. But it kept happening. Little noises at first, barely noticeable. A soft thump in the middle of the night, the sound of something brushing against the side of the house. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I felt it. That sense of being watched, that prickling on the back of my neck whenever I went outside after dark. I tried to ignore it, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, like a whisper that wouldn't quite fade away. And then one evening, it started to escalate. It was late, maybe 10 or 11 at night, and I was sitting in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book. I could hear the wind outside, rustling through the trees, and the occasional groan of the house shifting in the cold. Typical noises, the kind you get used to when you're living out here alone. But then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, through the window, I caught a glimpse of something. A shadow, darker than the night, moving between the trees. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe just the wind blowing the branches. But then it happened again, a flicker of movement. Fast, almost too fast to notice. I stared out into the yard, squinting to see if there was something out there, but there was nothing. Just trees swaying in the wind, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the grass. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But it kept happening. Every night for the next week, I'd catch glimpses of it, a shadow moving between the trees, and every time it felt like it was getting closer. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye, never quite able to focus on it, but always there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. It started to get under my skin, gnawing at my nerves. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake in bed, listening to every creak and groan, every gust of wind, my heart racing, waiting for something to happen. And then, one night, it did. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my body tense with that same sense of dread that had been building for days. I could hear the wind howling outside, louder than usual, and the trees scraping against the house like they were trying to get in. The whole house felt colder, like the temperature had dropped suddenly, but I didn't move. I was too scared to get up, too scared to look out the window because I knew something was out there. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock, 3 times right on the front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. No one ever came out here. I hadn't seen another person in weeks. The rational part of my brain tried to tell me it was just a branch, maybe the wind blowing something against the door, but I knew better. The knock came again, 3 solid, deliberate thuds. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Open the door? Call someone? But as I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. Through the small window by the front door, I saw it. A shadow, tall, dark, and motionless, standing just beyond the porch light. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It didn't move like one, didn't look like one. It was just there. And then slowly it started to shift, to melt into the darkness, as though it was pulling itself back into the shadows of the trees. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the place where the shadow had been, the silence in the house almost deafening now. The only sound was my heartbeat, hammering in my ears. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to move. I ran back upstairs, grabbed my phone, and dialed the local sheriff's office. I wasn't even sure what I was going to tell them. How do you explain that you're being haunted by a shadow? But before I could finish dialing, the phone slipped from my hand, crashing to the floor. I felt it again. That cold, prickling sensation like someone or something was watching me. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, this time inside the house, at the far end of the hallway. It was different now, closer. I could see it more clearly, like it had pulled itself free from the trees outside and followed me inside. It wasn't solid, not like a person, but it had form. A dark, amorphous shape, barely clinging to the edges of the light, as though it was made of the very darkness itself. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with fear. The shadow moved, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to know it was coming closer. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My hands fumbled for the doorknob, desperate to get out, to run, but I was trapped. The shadow seemed to swell, to spread, as though the darkness itself was closing in around me. And then in an instant, it vanished. I stood there, my back against the wall, gasping for breath. The hallway was empty. The cold air had returned to normal, and the house was silent again. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The next few days were a blur. I didn't sleep, didn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, felt it lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for me to let my guard down. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I packed a bag, planning to leave, to get as far away as possible, but something stopped me. As I stood by the front door, my hand on the knob, I felt it again. The presence. It was stronger now, more insistent, and for the first time, I understood. It wasn't trying to scare me away, it was drawing me closer. There was something in the house, something I hadn't seen, something behind the door. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob and slowly pulled the door open. The air was thick, heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. And then, there it was, the shadow. It stood in the doorway, waiting for me. But this time it didn't move. It didn't retreat into the darkness. It stayed, motionless, as though it was inviting me to step closer. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing right in front of it. And then I saw it. Behind the shadow, hidden in the darkness, was another door. A door I had never noticed before. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingers. The air around me seemed to thicken, the pressure building in my chest as I turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. What I saw on the other side, I still can't explain it. But the shadow wasn't just a shadow. It was a part of something bigger, something that had been waiting for me all along. And now that I've opened that door, it will never let me go. I never left the house. I couldn't. I belong to it now. I belong to it now. You probably don't understand what I mean by that, do you? I wouldn't have either before all of this. I thought I could just walk away, leave the house behind. But once you've seen what I've seen, once you've felt its pull, you can never really leave. Let me explain what happened after I opened that door. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp, musty, like the air had been trapped in that room for years. I couldn't see anything at first, just darkness. But it wasn't the same kind of darkness I was used to. This was something heavier, something alive. It seemed to pulse, to breathe, like it was waiting for me to step inside. And I did. I don't know why. Maybe I was in a trance, or maybe that thing had taken control of me, but I couldn't stop myself. One foot in front of the other, I walked into the room, the door closing behind me with a soft click. The moment it shut, the air changed. It became thick, like I was breathing through water. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, wrapping around me like cold hands. I tried to turn around, to leave, but my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen. Then slowly the room began to reveal itself. At first it was just shapes, tall, slender figures standing in the shadows, barely visible. I thought they were statues at first, maybe old furniture draped in cloth. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were moving. Not much, just a slight sway, like they were breathing, or waiting. I wasn't alone in that room. The figures didn't come any closer, though. They stayed where they were, watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, though I couldn't see their faces. The silence was deafening, the only sound my own shallow breathing. And then, out of nowhere, a voice whispered through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." It was a woman's voice, soft but clear. It echoed around the room as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. My heart raced, panic setting in, but my feet were still rooted to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't run, and I could feel the figures in the room closing in, even though they hadn't taken a single step. The voice spoke again, this time right next to my ear. "Do you see now?" I turned my head slowly, and that's when I saw her. She was standing just inches away from me, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. Her hair was long, matted and damp, like she had just crawled out of a grave. But it was her hands that made my blood run cold, skeletal and thin, with long dark nails that seemed to stretch into the shadows. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was a smile that sent a shiver down my spine, like she knew something I didn't, something that would ruin me. "You opened the door," she whispered, her voice almost a hiss. "Now it's yours." I didn't understand what she meant. I wanted to scream, to push her away, but I couldn't make a sound. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt it, the weight of the house, the presence that had been watching me all this time. It wasn't just a haunting, it was something much worse. It was a curse. "You belong to the house now," she said, her smile fading, "just like the rest of us." I looked around at the figures in the room, and suddenly I knew. They weren't statues, they weren't furniture. They were people, trapped just like me, caught in the same web of darkness. Some of them had been here for years, maybe even decades, and now I was one of them. The woman stepped back into the shadows, her form dissolving into the darkness like smoke. The figures around me began to move, slowly at first, then faster, as if they were drawn to me, pulled by some invisible force. I wanted to scream, to run, but it was too late. The darkness closed in around me, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my bed, the sun streaming through the window as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a terrible, vivid nightmare. But when I tried to get up, I couldn't. My body felt heavy, like I was anchored to the bed, to the house. I looked around the room, and that's when I saw it, the shadow. It was standing in the corner, watching me. Not moving, not speaking, just waiting. And I knew then, without a doubt, that it was never going to leave. Because it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was me. I don't know how long I've been here now. Days, weeks. Time doesn't seem to matter anymore. The house has swallowed me whole, and I can feel it changing me, piece by piece. I see the shadows everywhere now, moving through the walls, lurking in the corners of my vision. Sometimes I hear the others, the ones who came before me, whispering in the dark. They tell me things I don't want to know, about the house, about what it wants, and what it wants is me. I can feel myself slipping away, becoming part of the house, just like them. The shadows are growing stronger, pulling me deeper into their world. I've tried to leave, to run, but every time I reach the door, something pulls me back. It's like the house won't let me go. It's become a part of me, and I've become a part of it. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. Every day I feel myself fading, disappearing into the darkness. Soon I'll be just like the others, another shadow, trapped in the house, waiting for the next person to come along and open the door. So if you're ever out here in the woods and you see this house, don't come inside. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't follow the shadows. And whatever you do, don't open the door. Because once you do, there's no going back. You'll belong to the house just like the rest of us. It all started on a cold November night. I had just moved into a new town for work, some small place up north where the trees always seemed a little too dense, and the sky seemed to close in on you after dusk. The kind of place where everything feels just a bit off, you know? The locals were friendly enough, but there was always this underlying vibe, like there was something they weren't saying. I chalked it up to small town stuff, thinking maybe I was just an outsider they didn't trust yet. Anyway, I was out late, walking home from this bar just on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place to unwind after a long day. The streets were mostly empty by that time, probably around midnight or a little later. The wind had picked up, sharp and cold, cutting through the heavy jacket I was wearing. There weren't many streetlights along that road, and what few there were flickered, like they were about to give out at any moment. The air had that smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, a smell that clung to the back of your throat, making it hard to shake off. I remember pulling my coat tighter around me, quickening my pace just a little, when I first saw her. She was standing under one of those flickering lights, right at the corner where the road splits off into a dirt path that leads into the woods. At first, I didn't pay her much attention. I figured she was just another person on their way home, maybe waiting for someone. But something about the way she stood, so still, so rigid, it was unsettling. Her head was bowed slightly, and her long, dark hair fell over her face like she was hiding it on purpose. Instinctively, I slowed down. Something in me said not to get too close, but at the same time, I couldn't just walk past without acknowledging her. So I called out, "Hey, are you all right?" No answer. Not even a flinch. She didn't move an inch. I tried again, a bit louder this time. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. That's when I noticed it. The wind, it had completely stopped. The leaves, which had been rustling just moments before, were suddenly still. The only sound was my own breathing, sharp and uneven like I'd been running. But I hadn't. Not yet. I was close now, close enough to see that she was barefoot, her pale skin almost glowing in the dim light. Her clothes were thin, a white dress that looked like it belonged to another time, like something out of an old photograph. And her hands, God, her hands. They were just hanging there by her sides, limp, with fingers that seemed unnaturally long, too thin, like they'd break if she moved them. Every fiber in my body told me to turn around, to walk the other way. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity, or just plain stupidity. I took another step forward, my mouth dry, heart pounding in my chest, and then she looked up. Her face, Jesus. I'll never forget it. At first it looked normal, almost pretty in a haunting sort of way. But her eyes, they weren't right. They were black. Not just dark, but pitch black, like looking into two empty pits where her eyes should have been. No whites, no irises, just nothing. It was like staring into the abyss, and her mouth, it was twisted into this grotesque, unnatural grin, far too wide, like someone had stretched it too far across her face. For a moment, I couldn't move. I was frozen there, my legs glued to the pavement, my breath caught in my throat. Every survival instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't. I just stood there, staring at her as she stared back with those hollow eyes. Then she started moving. It was subtle at first, just a slight tilt of her head. But then her face began to change. Slowly, horribly, the skin around her mouth started to pull, like it was melting, stretching downwards until her grin turned into something else, something monstrous. Her jaw opened, wider than any human's should, revealing rows of sharp, crooked teeth. But it wasn't the teeth that terrified me. It was the sound, this low, guttural growl, like something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world, was clawing its way out of her. That's when I snapped out of it. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't dare look back. I could feel her, though. I swear I could feel her watching me, her cold, empty gaze burning into the back of my skull. I ran until I reached my house, practically throwing myself through the door and locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I collapsed on the floor, my whole body shaking. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps, waiting for her to come after me. But she didn't. The only sound was the wind howling outside, picking up again as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I convinced myself it was all a dream, some sort of waking nightmare brought on by too many drinks and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. A few days later, I started asking around town, casually at first. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I needed to know if anyone else had seen her. Most people just gave me odd looks or brushed me off. But one old guy, he must have been in his 70s, he looked at me with this strange expression when I mentioned the woman by the woods. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Who is she?" The old man shook his head. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say she was a woman who lived in these parts a long time ago. Others say she's not human at all, just something that takes on the form of a woman to lure people in." "Lure people in?" I repeated, a chill running down my spine. "They say she only shows herself to those who are vulnerable, those who are on the edge. Once she finds you, it's only a matter of time before she gets what she wants." I didn't ask what he meant by that. I didn't want to know. It's been months now, and I haven't seen her again. But I feel her. Every now and then, when the wind stops suddenly or the lights flicker for no reason, I feel her presence, watching, waiting. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in the house, I hear that low, guttural growl, just faint enough to make me wonder if it's real or if it's all in my head. But deep down, I know she's still out there. There are moments, fleeting, subtle moments, where the world around me feels wrong. It's hard to explain, but it's like everything gets heavier. The air, the light, even the sounds outside. Like the universe itself pauses, just for a second. And in those moments, I can feel her presence, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. My mind races, heart thudding in my chest, because I know what's coming next. It happened again, just last week. It was late, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, so I sat in the living room with the TV on, trying to distract myself. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the screen and the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling. You know how it is in old houses. Every little sound seems amplified when you're alone, especially at night. I must have drifted off at some point because when I opened my eyes, the TV was just static, that awful hissing sound filling the room. The clock on the wall had stopped, the second hand frozen in place. I got up, feeling disoriented, still half asleep. The wind outside had died down completely, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. And then I heard it, a soft knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, like someone was testing to see if I was awake. I froze. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe one of my neighbors, though I didn't know them well enough for anyone to be knocking at my door in the middle of the night. But there was something different about these knocks. Something unnatural. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Another set of knocks, a little louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach twisted and my skin prickled with cold sweat. I was rooted in place, every instinct telling me not to open that door. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't going to leave until I acknowledged it. I crept toward the door, my feet feeling like lead. The sound of my heartbeat echoed in my ears, drowning out everything else. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath. Silence. For a brief, stupid moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just half asleep and hearing things. Then through the peephole, I saw her. She was standing there on my porch, her long black hair hanging in front of her face, the same white dress clinging to her gaunt frame. But this time, there was something different about her. Something worse. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, like her neck had been broken, and her arms hung limply by her sides. The air around her seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was warping, bending to accommodate her presence. And her eyes, those black, empty voids, they were staring right at me. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my body felt like it was made of stone. There was no escape, no running this time. She had found me. The knock started again, louder, more insistent now. Knock, knock, knock. It was almost like she was mocking me, daring me to open the door, but I didn't. I couldn't. I backed away, retreating into the shadows of the living room, my eyes never leaving the door. My legs felt weak, my pulse pounding in my throat as I tried to steady myself. Then the door handle began to turn. It moved slowly, creaking in the silence, the metallic sound cutting through the thick tension in the air. My heart skipped a beat, and for a split second I thought she was going to come inside, that she'd finally gotten to me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then, the handle stopped turning, and everything went quiet. The silence was worse. It was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I strained to hear any sound, any indication that she was still there. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no knocking, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to stand up, my legs trembling beneath me. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door again. My hand hovered over the handle, hesitation gripping me, but I needed to know. I needed to see if she was still there. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever came next, and pulled open the door. The porch was empty, no sign of her, no tracks in the dirt, nothing. I stood there for a moment, blinking in confusion, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. Had she been real? Had I imagined the whole thing? My hands were shaking, my throat dry as I scanned the yard for any trace of her. But there was nothing, just the faint breeze rustling the trees and the distant chirp of insects. It was as if she had never been there at all. I closed the door, bolted it shut, and sank into the nearest chair, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak, every gust of wind felt like her coming back, waiting for the right moment to strike. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me. Every time I passed a window or glanced at a dark corner, I expected to see her standing there, her black eyes fixed on me. I stopped going out at night. I avoided the road where I'd first seen her, but deep down, I knew it was pointless. No matter what I did, no matter where I went, she was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. It's been a week now since the last knock. I thought maybe, just maybe, I was free of her, that somehow I'd escaped whatever it was she wanted from me. But last night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my window. Not knocking this time. Scratching, like long nails scraping against the glass, slow and deliberate. I didn't look. I couldn't bring myself to. I knew if I did, I'd see her. I'd see those eyes again, staring back at me, empty and endless. I stayed under the covers, pretending like I didn't hear it, like if I ignored her, she'd go away. But she didn't. The scratching went on for hours, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, as if she was trying to break through the glass. I lay there, heart pounding, every muscle in my body locked in place, waiting for the sound to stop. It didn't. And now, as I sit here telling you this, I can hear it again. The scratching. It's coming from the door this time, and I know, deep down, I won't be able to ignore it much longer. She's coming for me, and there's nothing I can do to stop her.